this on? Well, welcome to the 9th annual President's Day address, which is kind of unbelievable that I've had 9 of these, and some remarks. Donald J. Trump has separated friends from friends, and for good reason, I suppose. There's much hysteria has surrounded the man, and there are perhaps many legitimate criticisms to be made of him. Much of the hysteria has surrounded his campaign promise or slogan, to make America great again. Taken by some to mean, to make America white again, this slogan has nevertheless caught on and has an idea in it that's very important. The idea is of national greatness. What would it mean, to be a great nation? Do we want to be a great nation? For an answer to these questions, it perhaps is smartest to turn first to the Federalist Papers, the defense of our Constitution written in 1788 and 89, where Alexander Hamilton and James Madison primarily define for us what American greatness will be. Now, of course, greatness in one era will not be the same greatness in another era, but it's a good place to start. What did the Federalists mean by making America great again? And what would it mean to do that now? This is the topic of tonight's talk by Arthur Milikh, my old boss at the Heritage Foundation, and he's the associate director of the Simon Center for Principles in Politics, or Politics and Principles. I get that wrong sometimes. He's the author of many popular articles in the press, including on some controversies involving professors who have been attacked on universities. He's also written on civility and barbarism for National Affairs and Ben Franklin and the Free Press, I think also in National Affairs. And Arthur is going to talk tonight for about 40 minutes on the topic of Donald Trump and American greatness. That's the title of his talk, and please join me in welcoming Arthur Milikh.
Hi guys, thank you so much for coming. Thank you very much, Professor Yenna, for having me. It's a pleasure to be out here. I taught a class earlier today, and I was telling the students what a beautiful city this is. You guys might not see this because you guys are surrounded by it daily, but DC is a very bureaucratic city, full of bureaucrats who are sophisticated, but not usually deep or interesting. And what makes that worse is that the city is full of bureaucratic architecture that is a kind of reflection of these souls. The souls go into the buildings, these ugly sort of Soviet-style government buildings, and they deserve one another in a way. Whereas here you see mountains and freedom. It's very charming. We're going to talk about Donald Trump, and he's a very controversial person. And as Scott outlined, I want to make an argument for you guys that the president should be taken seriously. And he agrees in many regards with the Federalists, and especially Alexander Hamilton. And I want to use Hamilton to show you that we should take Trump seriously, despite the way that he speaks. So, the success of Donald Trump's presidential campaign is partly due to his promise to make America great again. I think this promise is more than a catchy campaign slogan. It captures something true about where we are, about where our nation has drifted. And it invites us to reflect on the meaning of national greatness. Trump, rarely shy to speak his mind, has told us many times what he thinks it means to make America great again. But if we want to deepen our understanding of American greatness, it means going beyond day-to-day political events. We need to turn to one of the most important sources that set us on our national trajectory. I think the clearest articulation of national greatness is found in the Federalists, the authors of which understood themselves to be founding not just any nation, but a new kind of nation, with a new kind of greatness. Publius, the pseudonym under which Hamilton, Madison, and Jay wrote the Federalist Papers, considers deeply both the meaning of national greatness and its causes. So I propose to take you on a trip tonight. I want to guide you through some of the subtle and extremely interesting arguments made in the Federalist, especially by Hamilton. He's the leader of this national greatness movement, which essentially lays out and correctly predicted the growth and expansion of our nation into what it is today. It's easy to mock Trump, but Trump and Publius, as we'll see, agree on certain critical points. Since in this short lecture we can't undertake a comprehensive account of greatness for Publius, we will focus specifically on the means of obtaining it, the means and not the ends, but we'll talk about the ends a little bit at the very conclusion as well. Publius's argument, I'll keep using this name Publius, so remember who I mean, if you haven't read the Federalist paper. It's the one name under which these three writers write, Publius. Publius's argument is essentially this: commerce will serve as the means by which America will develop its form of greatness. Successful commerce, combined with naval power, in turn, is a means to achieving national sovereignty, the freeing of the nation, insofar as possible, from external compulsion, and thereby securing its ability to choose for itself. Our Republican principles, I'm going to attempt to prove to you guys, necessitate national greatness in terms of national power. While there are many differences between Trump and Publius, both understand that striving for national greatness is less a choice than a necessity, given the consequences of national weakness. During the presidential campaign, Trump wanted to make clear that we are not a nation for whom circumstances are dictated, but a nation to a great degree in charge of its own fate. Publius and Trump understand, moreover, that citizens must believe that they are part of something worthy of their respect, which depends on a pride in Republican self-government. That's the end. So, part one, Trump on greatness, self-rule at home and abroad. During Donald Trump's campaign and since then, he has articulated with some degree of clarity his understanding of America's greatness and why he thinks the country should be made great again. I think that the best way to look at this is three general categories of how Trump looked at this. There are more, but I think these are good organizing principles. So, number one, in the domestic sphere, Trump seems to want to reverse the national self-hatred imposed by the left, which is hostile to citizen self-respect. For more than a generation, progressive doctrines advancing the alleged moral illegitimacy of America on account of its irremediable bigotry, sexism, and xenophobia have taught citizens to despise rather than to revere their nation. From the perspective of a citizen, this is very important, from the perspective of a citizen, by which I mean someone capable of fulfilling duties for their nation and capable of being sentimentally attached to it, these doctrines are hostile to the self-respect proper to citizens. These doctrines teach that almost nothing about their nation is lovable, that their pride cannot be attached to it, and that they cannot find their self-respect through it. One way or another, such a psychological state is not stable and cannot last long. I think that's part of Trump's analysis. Second, draining the swamp. That's Trump's famous phrase. It's a prerequisite for making America great again. It broadly refers to a return to self-government. The swamp's inhabitants, on Trump's reading, care little about citizens' lives, and their behavior demonstrated their willingness to sell out the nation's interests to the highest bidder, whether these bidders be foreign nations, multinationals, or various interest groups, in order to preserve their own class. Trump won over blue-collar America, who sensed the selling out of their own interests by both parties. These swamp dwellers are cross-party, who sensed the selling out of their own interests by both parties, both of which had lost their sense of the nation's interests, thinking about the nation as a whole. Third, contrary to the progressive teaching that America's power abroad tends to oppress and that the international brotherhood of harmony among nations may yet blossom, Trump saw great stakes competition between nations. Quote, this is Trump, "We are in a competition with the world, and I want America to win." On numerous occasions, Trump observed that China has successfully sought to slowly, almost silently, though with cunning intention, guided by lofty ambition, to undermine America's interests through economic strategies, and that Iran has sought a nuclear weapon while giving us the illusion that they're merely a treaty-abiding regime. You know, they believe in contracts just like we do. They're just a normal middle-class regime that honors laws. Accordingly, Our citizens, this is Trump again, quote, have lived through one international humiliation after another under the Obama administration. As a consequence of this humiliation, again Trump, we can be assured that other nations will not treat America with respect. To be a humiliated nation is to be a nation that is held in contempt. While Trump's words may sound vulgar and combative to effete excessively tame and over-civilized spirits, many similar arguments are expressed in the Federalist, which can help us fill out Trump's broad outline, situate our thinking, and understand what exactly is at stake in this expression, make America great again. So that's his broad analysis, I think. Okay, I want to go to the Federalist. So part two is a new form of greatness, national greatness. Before we try to understand our big question, what is national greatness, we need to say a few words about other forms of greatness which have existed in the past and which will no doubt continue to exist as human alternatives. Publius thought through with great care alternative political arrangements. Publius's new political science will create a new kind of power and thus a new understanding of greatness, which will set an example for the world. And as I'll make clear, an example that has been imitated by the world, too. The first contrast is Europe. She has achieved her imperial greatness, quote, by her arms and by her negotiations, by force and by fraud, end quote. We should note that imperial greatness through military conquest and or mercantilism is a political alternative still available today. While old Europe has declined, the Europe that the Federalists were arguing against and fighting against is done. I mean, if you guys turn on the news and you see what's going on in Europe, that Europe is done. But contemporary China, in its mercantilist colonization of parts of Africa for the sake of resource extraction, and its expansive military policies in the South China Sea, demonstrate the durability of this alternative. It still exists. National greatness is also in contradistinction to individual greatness, especially of the kind produced in ancient republics. Another contrast. Ancient republics misunderstood the principle of expanding the size of republics. Small ancient republics bred great individuals motivated by their longing for honor and glory, and these passions led to much political tumult and instability. Rome, for instance, attained, quote, the political of human greatness, Publius says. But it led to domestic factions and insurrection, circumstances which, quote, could never promote the greatness or happiness of the people of America. Too much individual greatness. Modern Republican greatness, our form of greatness, will to a lesser extent depend on the bright talents and exalted endowments of individual men of antiquity. That's not our form. Individual greatness and imperial greatness are in contrast to Publius's own enterprise, that of, this is a key quote, that of, quote, erecting one great American system. Empire, individuals, systems, a system, a constitutional system. That will be our source of greatness. The new union structure, its system, will to a great degree subdue the passions animating individuals in ancient republics, or at least direct them away from politics. The union structure will to some degree even make such individuals less necessary. We won't rely on them as much anymore. No doubt, Publius hopes to attract great individuals, like future George Washingtons, to the highest posts of government. He doesn't just want a great system run by mediocrities. Nevertheless, America's Republican institutions, rather than relying on the virtues of great individuals alone, will constrain these individuals so as to induce them to serve the public. Though we don't have time to get into the details, it's clear that the president, who has the motives of fame, is limited in his freedom by other branches of government. Therefore, his greatness is not counted on alone. In fact, his constraint may encourage more greatness than he otherwise might have. Publius is aware that America will contain smaller men, but greater politics. American greatness will largely inhere in an enormous, very stable nation, which multiplies wealth through commerce. The wealth generated therein, in turn, will translate into military strength, which allows for the possibility of national sovereignty and self-rule on the national level. Okay, part two, a commercial republic, commerce. For Publius, neither war nor conquest, but a, quote, prosperous commerce is now perceived and acknowledged by all enlightened statesmen to be the most useful as well as the most productive source of national wealth. Commerce has thus become a primary object of enlightened statesmen's political cares. Commerce is a political matter. For Publius, the aim of commercial policy is not merely opulence and prosperity. I think that we commonly think that today. It's not merely opulence and prosperity. It's for the sake of securing national independence and creating the conditions to maintain it. Commercial policy is thus guided by political rather than economic considerations alone. That main source of America's power should be first traced to its main source of wealth, is a lesson that Trump understands well. Quote, "You have to be wealthy in order to be great," he repeated constantly. You may find that formulation crude, but its truth is not in doubt. Now, obtaining national wealth requires the successful maintenance, not to say the liberation, of our, quote, unequaled spirit of enterprise. Remember that, unequaled spirit of enterprise. That's a key phrase for Publius. This unmeasurable, unquantifiable spirit, if properly ordered through the system is going to order it, if properly ordered, becomes an inexhaustible mine of national wealth. This spirit is an inexhaustible mine of national wealth, which should be nurtured and protected by laws and statesmen. The spirit is a resource, Publius says, to be used for the nation's happiness and security, a resource which will be directed into the world. We will shoot this spirit into the world, as we'll see in a moment. Now, this spirit seems to occur either in a greater degree or in a different form in America than it does in other nations, presumably because it is liberated from the opinions and laws which restrain its development elsewhere. Unlike the European nations of the time, America's spirit leads to, quote, mastery. That's a very important word for those who were in the Descartes class earlier today. This is another form of mastery. Hamilton is aware of this. Of mastery of various branches of commerce, industry, and science, rather than the mastery of other peoples. America's enterprising spirit benefits all citizens and the nation as a whole, and not just monarchs or aristocrats. This spirit for Publius is America's unique comparative advantage, our main source of competitiveness with other nations, and the means by which America will conquer the hemisphere, if not the globe. Through this spirit, America will create the conditions abroad in which it can preserve its own sovereignty. Importantly, there is no choice but to develop and rely upon this comparative advantage, as other kinds of national power are unavailable to us. Not only is a warlike spirit absent in Americans, so too would imperial conquest undermine Republican principles. And we're just no good at it. We've tried to conquer nations and we're terrible at it, for a variety of interesting reasons, but we can't do that. It's not available. Only this, the cultivation of this spirit and shooting it abroad, and I'm going to get into the details of that, is what's available to us. Now, let's look at the details of the spirit. That's the broad outline. As experienced by all, commerce leads to the pleasing reward for one's toils, the reward of which will be protected by property rights and the government's power to secure and enliven the blossoming of unequal acquisitive faculties of individuals. Do you guys remember that phrase, that expression? That's in Federalist 10. We all have unequal faculties of acquiring property, and we want to encourage those because some people are very talented, and we want to protect those talents. Securing this spirit leads to a great liberation of human energies, similar to the way modern natural science unlocks the energies of material nature to use natural forces to satisfy man's desires. In considering its roots, however, we should heed Machiavelli's warning in avoiding the error of, on the one hand, admiring this action, and on the other hand, condemning the principal cause of it. In other words, the root of this, I'm going to give it away, is avarice, Hamilton says, the root of our commercial spirit is avarice. But following Machiavelli, we shouldn't say, oh, we like the fruits of avarice, we like what it produces, but when we look at the cause, we hate it because we're too moralistic. We shouldn't do that. We should follow this argument. You know, Publius reflects on the nature, in explaining avarice, Publius reflects on the nature of avarice by contrasting its effects under circumstances of union, national union, or disunion. This is how he's going to discuss how it works. He says that the introduction and circulation of precious metals and paper money, which removes the natural limit on spoilage and allows for hoarding. You know, you can only have so many tomatoes, but if you have money or gold, you can in principle have a lot of tomatoes, you know, because you have buying power. Paper money removes the natural limit on spoilage and allows for hoarding, enlivens and promotes the desire for wealth. So under circumstances of union, Publius connects avarice to the spirit of enterprise, as union, in ordering this passion, channeling it, makes it productive. You can satisfy this desire in a union safely. Your property rights are protected. Contract rights are protected. Publius's analysis suggests that the passion itself is morally neutral and should be viewed in terms of its effects. How productive is it? Since America will domestically become a free trade zone, union increases the motion and vigor of commerce by allowing this passion to satisfy itself while being channeled through a system of laws and secured by property rights. Moreover, avarice will be honored and encouraged and can lead to great national projects which rouse citizens' pride and redounds to them in profits. In a state of disunion, however, avarice will not cohere with the national interest. Indeed, America's fortuitous geography is at once favorable to our enterprising spirit under union and hostile to it under disunion. What seemed like qualities advantageous to commerce, like the similarity of our habits of character, our common language, and the easy geographic access between states, would, without union, entice avarice towards illicit trade in black markets. This could even culminate over time in hostile actions between individual states as they grow dissimilar in character and their interests begin to conflict. So here's the system. Here's how the system works. The union is a form, the structured arena in which this and other related passions are productively satisfied. They can satisfy themselves in this system, this great system. The union's form will organize the matter, the passions, and enlist it for the nation's benefit. Okay, taking a step back into the broader political sphere, the proper use of our enterprising spirit brings not only prosperity, but liberation from seeming necessities. That is, unfavorable consequences await nations who fail to properly develop this spirit. For instance, despite potentially lucrative natural resources, Germany does not possess a commercial spirit, the result of which means that Germany's emperor, I'm quoting here, has several times been compelled to owe obligations to the pecuniary succors of other nations for the preservation of his essential interests, and is unable, upon the strength of his own resources, to sustain a long and continued war. These are political necessities that he cannot meet because this commercial spirit has not been developed, Publius claims. The absence of this spirit means that Germany, as a result of its poverty, relies on others for its interest and preservation. Part of Publius's lesson is that attaining wealth through commerce is done with a view to overcoming the seeming necessities which compel Germany. Successful commerce makes it such that one's interests depend on oneself, rather than relying on either the goodness or the arms of others. If properly developed, America's enterprising spirit culminates in national independence, which results in, as we'll see in a moment, dictating the terms to Europe, rather than them dictating the terms to us. That is no doubt part of what Trump means by saying it's time to declare our economic independence once again, especially when one considers our relation to China. Part 3, our commercial spirit vis-a-vis other nations. So now we've briefly discussed the origin of this spirit and how to nurture it. But Publius continues, what especially distinguishes America's commercial character is our adventurous spirit. We're also adventurous. Just as this spirit leads to mastery over industries, it also brings about uneasy sensations in other nations. They grow uneasy from this adventurous spirit. Our enterprising spirit may cause the perception or the fact of our interference in their interests. Federalist 11 begins by observing the natural desire of foreign nations whose interests conflict with ours to weaken us by intervening in our politics and commerce. The jealousies, fears, and ambitions of foreign nations drive them to attempt to, quote, restrain our growth. Europe, end quote, Europe, in fact, wants to clip America's wings and prevent what they see as our potentially dangerous greatness. They see our greatness arising. In openly or subtly acting against America, foreign nations are, then and today, foreign nations are acting well or rationally from the point of view of their interests, something Publius argues America should do in turn, in our own particular way. Accordingly, the ever-present need to intervene, if only subtly, in other nations' spaces is a compulsion that we too are under. They're compelled, and so are we. But our new form of intervention will be less direct than the interventions of the past, since it will be commercial. Though commercial power seems soft, it may nevertheless eventually culminate in our ability to, quote, dictate the terms of the connection between the old world and the new. It'll create a fundamental change. America must consciously act to restrain foreign desires and ambitions. The restraint of these is achieved first, of course, you can predict, through a powerful navy which can induce the impracticability of success in our adversaries, reduce their belief that they can succeed against us. Naval power acts both directly and on the imagination and resolve of our competitors. The moderation of foreign desires and ambitions does and should depend as much as possible on us, not on them. A developed navy means America would be in such a situation that, quote, quote, a price would be set not only on our friendship, but on our neutrality. Arguably, this characterizes the situation America is in now. Many nations favor America specifically on account of our military power. One wonders if, for example, the nations surrounding China, friendly to us today, would continue to favor us if our military shrank, or if those nations would choose, under threat of the Chinese gun, to continue to trade with us if their choice was between commercial gain or Chinese military domination. These are still very real alternatives. But America will restrain foreign desires through other, more tacit and long-term strategies as well. Publius presents America as being compelled by a, quote, irresistible and unchangeable course of nature, end quote, to develop commercially, industrialize, and to expand its spirit into the world. America's commercial productivity will compel other nations, perhaps a great portion of the world even, to compete on our terms. That's the subtle commercial influence, a competition in which we have the advantage. This competition, Publius indicates, will alter other nations' self-understanding. The future, Publius correctly saw, belongs to enlightened commercial republics. In one of the most interesting passages of the Federalist, Publius draws our attention to yesteryear's allegedly profound philosophers. We've kind of even forgotten about them because they're done. Cornelius de Pau, Count Buffon, Abbé Raynal, who asserted European superiority based on racialist theories derived from an alleged science of natural history. This science, this is a wonderful quote, gravely asserted that all animals, and with them the human species, degenerate in America, that even dogs cease to bark after having breathed a while in our atmosphere. They thought that these were scientific theories that accounted for their own superiority and our inferiority and justified their empire. But the effectual truth of commercial power, truer than Europe's false sciences, will destroy over time the political justifications of the old world and expose its boastfulness. And in doing so, it will democratize the world. In other words, the power of the passions, avarice, what we just talked about, its productivity, the power of the passions, when liberated and properly ordered by the American system, will be demonstrated in the arena of the world. They simply cannot, these other nations, simply cannot compete with our productivity and scientific innovations. In this way, America's commercial power will, quote, teach that assuming brother, Europe, moderation. And their theories, end quote, and their theories justifying their pride will disappear along with their political orders. Our commercial power will continue to rid other nations of false sciences and arrogant pretensions upon which they make claims regarding their alleged greatness. Enlightened commercial republics will compel other nations to compete commercially, which also means that the classic virtues of the yeoman farmer proposed by Jefferson will not find a firm place in this new world. To take a step further, many old world pieties will slowly lose their hold over minds or be transformed to fit these new commercial conditions, as the relative weakness of these pieties comes to be felt more and more through engagement with commerce and science. One observes this in many nations throughout the world today, which have been forced to abandon their ancestral orders and attempt, by whatever means available, and often with very little success, to compete with our ways. The world is full of nations like this. Part 4, passivity and activity. Just as America is compelled by certain necessities, so too must foreign nations exploit the weaknesses of their competitors with a view to inducing passive as opposed to active commerce, a distinction Publius develops in Federalist 11. Publius presents commerce as a mild form of warfare in the industrialized world, perhaps even the first wave of American foreign policy. While commerce is not violent, it is competitive and seeks supremacy and advantage, not, again, only opulence and private satisfactions, as I think we think of it too much today. A passive commerce means being determined by other nations' wills, which occurs when nations give up the means to preserve commercial independence, a favorite topic of Trump's. Trump's program to reevaluate all our trade deals stems from this very desire, I believe. Passivity means that foreign nations will, quote, prescribe the conditions of our political existence, end quote. This can happen slowly, over time, not noticed by the public, but can in effect choke off a nation's vital interests. Active commerce, on the other hand, seems to mean the development of industries with a view to creating the conditions in which, again, a nation can secure its interests abroad. Commerce is used by nations to obstruct and retard adversaries' growth and development, through which they can influence the conduct, that's a quote, of competitor nations. This may mean, for instance, that nations choose, based on political criteria, who should have favored access to their markets. This is a question that we have totally said we are never considering, and it's obviously on Hamilton's mind and Trump's. To evaluate such goals, statesmen must look to the non-obvious secondary or tertiary effects to comprehend the extent of a policy's advantages. Commenting on his times, Publius argues that by banning British ships, for banning British ships from American ports, America can inflate the cost of British goods by forcing Britain to pay the Dutch to transport their goods. Through this, America can make the Dutch the master of British commerce in America, and thereby inflate the cost of British goods. Publius would consider the key calculation as not the increased cost of these goods incurred by American customers, as we today assume to be the only real downside, but rather the weakening of a competitor's influence and the obstruction of its long-term designs. The goal is to make adversaries less wealthy, viewing trade as long-term political strategy. President Trump has proven his understanding of this lesson on several occasions by invoking the foolhardiness of America's many trade agreements, especially those with China. I'm quoting Trump. America became the world's dominant economy by becoming the world's dominant producer. The wealth this created was shared broadly, creating the biggest middle class the world has ever known. But then, America changed its policy by promoting development, from promoting development in America to promoting development in other nations. We allowed foreign countries to subsidize their goods, devalue their currencies, violate their agreements, and cheat in every way imaginable, and our politicians did nothing about it. Trillions of our dollars and millions of our jobs flowed overseas as a result. This is a direct affront to our founding fathers. They wanted this country to be strong, they wanted to be independent, and they wanted it to be free. This is perfectly in line with almost everything that Hamilton says. Today we often misidentify the naturalness of foreign desires to intervene in our affairs, dreaming that other nations do not understand themselves as consciously competing with us through trade. Trade is a form, for Hamilton, of warfare. It need not only be that, but it turns out to be that frequently between competitors. For Publius, it would be preposterous to actively allow the enrichment of nations which, on account of it, will become viable competitors, as we have done in the recent past with China. Not only do we owe China trillions of dollars in debt accrued in our desire to close our eyes to unsustainable spending, more importantly, China's 1.3 billion consumers have given it the leverage other countries don't have to demand technological transfers. So they say, you can have access to our markets, but only under certain conditions. Today, the Chinese say, basically in muffled voices, the following: come sell in our markets, but leave your secrets behind. Your avarice will be satisfied in the short term, but since you may lose your competitive advantage in this exchange, we will gain in the long run. In this regard, Trump and Publius agree on the benefits of trade. Cheap commercial goods for American consumers is not the goal, but consideration for the long-term competition and the power and respect that comes with it ought to be. For Publius, our adversaries will aim to slowly choke our influence and suffocate our enterprising spirit, partly with a view to diminishing America's self-confidence. That's the other goal. Self-confidence is required for our enterprising spirit to blossom. It requires a sense of predomination and unobstructed hopes of satisfaction. This is what American optimism means, in a way. We always measure it. How optimistic are we? This is partly of what's beneath the importance of that optimism. In other words, without commercial predomination or its prospect, our spirit may flounder and will be stifled and lost, Hamilton says. But upon our enterprising spirit depends the future of the nation. Its loss will likely culminate in, quote, poverty and disgrace, while its successful maintenance and projection may culminate in the nation becoming, quote, the admiration and envy of the world. Though it may sound odd to modern sensibilities, rather than seeking the approval of world opinion, a powerful nation will become both envied and admired by other nations. Admiration seems to originate in sufficient fear, which would restrain foreign nations' ambitions and desires. Without this restraint, foreigners will have, quote, no scruples and remorse end quote, indirectly or indirectly undermining our interests and confidence. On the other hand, a nation can become despicable by its weakness, end quote, such that it may not be able to even choose neutrality. Accordingly, our power will be an important source of our respectability, without which competitors will have, quote, nothing to fear from us. Admiration, moreover, would seem additionally to imply possessing something honorable and worthy of imitation, like our Republican principles themselves. Nevertheless, foreign fears, which only a great nation can inspire, will set the limits on foreign ambitions. Their fears of us will set the limits on their ambitions, and thereby limit their desire or need these nations experience to naturally, as we said before, intervene in our affairs. Maintaining this psychological state, envy and admiration, Publius suggests, characterizes a good outcome. That is a model that we should pursue, is a stable model. Let's conclude, and then we can do questions. I have just laid out for you the theory by which Publius thought America should and would achieve national greatness. I think to a great extent he augured correctly. If you are willing to separate for a moment Trump the man, Trump the tweeter, Trump the showman, from Trump the president with a vision of American greatness and the means to sustain it, which is not always an easy task, I admit that, I believe that the president is not far from Publius in his judgments and remedies. and not far from the true causes of what has made this nation so strong and stable for so long. I want to leave you with one parting thought. I have just described the means to attaining national greatness. But what is the end of national greatness? So that's the natural question we should ask. After all, greatness must be choice-worthy for its own sake. It must be either the best thing in itself or the best thing available. I believe that for Publius, national greatness is achieved for the sake of political liberty, which is an end in itself. As one scholar has observed, Publius associates liberty not only with happiness, but with dignity. Self-rule is choice-worthy and is the legitimate end of greatness. Human dignity rests in our capacity to rule ourselves, both as individuals and as a nation. All other things are for the sake of establishing or preserving it. President Trump's rhetoric often points to this, if only opaquely. For instance, draining the swamp means we are being ruled illegitimately without our consent. China is robbing us points to our enterprising spirit being exploited and harmed. Making America great again in its highest sense, though often stated awkwardly, points, I think, to reviving our pride in self-rule. Thank you very much. Well, questions? Yes, sir.
So you speak a lot about, I guess he speaks a lot about trade as warfare.
Yeah.
And the government becoming bureaucratic in our economy. So, and your speech is primarily about Trump making America great again. So
yeah.
My question kind of circles around to Obamacare, which he campaigned on.
Hamilton is not for Obamacare.
Pardon me, I'm talking about Trump. Like repealing Obamacare, all of them campaigned on repealing Obamacare, and then when the election occurred, it became repeal and replace. So I'm curious, with regards to your feelings on Trump making America great again, how do you feel about that particular, like the AHCA, and not fully repealing the ACA? Well,
look, there are a couple of questions inside of what you say. I'm not an expert on Obamacare or repealing the ACA. Let me speak to where you were kind of going before. You want self-government, and you don't want a bureaucracy that governs the economy. All right, fair enough. But yet I say, on the other hand, that no, there should be some kind of direction, that this isn't just spontaneous and arbitrary, that there are great political stakes involved. Is that a contradiction or not? Well, let me give you guys a couple of examples of that. So we used to invest considerably more money into military R&D than we do today. And there are certain industries that have been taken over by China that we used to do domestically, but upon which our national security depends. There are certain microchips that go into our airplanes that only China now produces. So is that good or bad? Government investment into R&D, specifically into military R&D, has for years created like many industries that have gone later into the private sector and become remarkable things. And so the question is, do we seed these industries elsewhere, especially those upon which our national security depends, or do we try and preserve them somehow? So that's part of it. The second part of it is that what happens in situations where there's not fair competition? We say that we trade with China, but is it trade, is it genuinely free trade when they're constantly cheating? When their governments are intentionally deflating the cost of their goods by funding these industries? And then the next question becomes, well, why are they doing this? Like, this can't go on. We all know that free market principles over the long haul work considerably better than funding these industries. And I'm by no means advocating for that. Why are they doing this? Like, do they not understand that? They're really smart. All of their elites have gone to all of the schools here, all of the best schools here. They know all of this. The answer is, they consciously understand themselves as competing with us with a view to undermining certain industries of ours. And over the long haul, undermining the nation in general. They have great ambitions. They believe that they are an ancient empire whose turn has come to rule. Now, again. And sponsoring these industries is with a view to targeting and weakening us. So the question would be how we respond. I don't have all the answers to that. I'm not a trade expert. But the point of these kinds of statements by Trump and the point of looking at Hamilton is to reawaken in us an understanding that trade is a form, when great powers compete, trade is a form of competition. Trade need not simply go in the direction of, well, we all just want to enrich ourselves. We all just want to live more comfortably. We all just want more and more cheaper and cheaper consumer goods. And so there's a kind of brotherhood that can develop between us. That's a very recent dogma that Hamilton contradicts, and that Trump is the first mainstream politician, he's not mainstream, national level politician to identify that. Yes, sir.
More on the topic of trade.
Yes.
It's said that, a few economists will say that free trade is a bad idea.
Of course. And they're right.
So in this,
Yeah.
in this theoretical sphere, will political considerations be going against economic considerations consistently, only in the trade sphere? Where else do they conflict?
Yeah.
And also, what does it speak to? Because the economist view seems to decontextualize the nation, if that makes sense. It's what's good for people, whereas
Yes.
the political has
Yes.
a lot to do with what's good for the people in this nation, what's good for the nation itself.
Yes.
So,
No, I think
that makes sense. Just
yes, it makes
considerations
perfect
on
sense. That is very well said. So just to slightly restate, here's how economists look at things, for the most part. They say, this is not a nation. This is just an entity, and inside of this entity are consumers. You are all consumers, first and foremost, not Americans. And as consumers, you are maximizing your good. And there should be no restraints on you maximizing your good, your utility, let's say. The question that this young man asks is, well, are there national level interests that are somehow superior, either morally or politically or strategically, and that should override individual small choices and looking at individuals merely as consumers? And so that is Hamilton's position. Now, on your previous point, and that is the prejudice, I think, of all economists today. None of them want to look at, very few, let's say, want to look at the nation as a whole. But all of the classic economists did. Adam Smith, Hamilton, they all understood that the nation has interests of its own, and that those interests are very frequently long-term and have to be looked at that way because there is always competition. So the second part of your question is, well, don't we basically know that free trade works and like that's the best setup? There's no question about that. There's absolutely no question about that. In fact, what I described to you earlier about what Hamilton thinks is going to be our comparative advantage, our industriousness, our capacity to master various industries, our capacity to master science, the sciences, using that spirit and compelling others to compete with us on those terms will be in our favor. And the net result of that will be, as it has proven to be, the destruction of all of these monarchies, the destruction of all of these aristocracies, the destruction of these tyrannies like the Soviet Union, who similarly could not compete in spending. Part of their collapse, they could not compete in military spending because they had no income. They had no productivity like we did. It works without doubt. The question is the kind of trade that we have lately begun to engage in free trade or not? I believe that the kind of trade that, for example, we engage in with Britain, just to use that as an example, is free trade. There are no unfair advantages that are intentionally given by the other government with a view to undercutting our industries, with a view to undermining our advantages. That's the difference. I don't think that it is free trade when, as I mentioned before, the Chinese invite in Boeing, for example, into their country, and say, yes, now you have not only access to our domestic markets, in other words, we have customers and the government will be your customer, but in addition, you will have labor that is 10 times cheaper than in America. But we want one thing in exchange. We want all of your industrial secrets. will have minders. They go into your factories. They understand your industrial design. They understand the machines that you use to create the jet engines. They understand the design of the jet engines. They understand the electronics. In 5 years, they replicate it. And then, thank you very much for coming, Boeing. You've been very useful to us. Now we have our own. The protection of IP is one of the most important things that should be ruthlessly enforced. That is the cause of, domestically, our incredible success. Like, here, let me give you guys an example. So, we're always talking about entrepreneurs and innovators. These people innovate products, okay? They create something that has never been created before. Do you guys know anybody that owns a small business? Are their whole lives devoted to this business? To incubating it, nurturing it, bringing it to market, safeguarding it. Do you think anybody in their right mind would do that if their IP wasn't protected? It would be a fool's errand to say, Mark Zuckerberg, I'm going to devote my whole life to creating this empire when I know that tomorrow somebody's going to steal all of my coding and I won't be protected. It is the source of, it is one of the laws that protects this enterprising spirit in us. And when it's stolen abroad this way, that is not fair trade. And free trade must be fair trade. Yes, sir?
So then how would you propose to protect intellectual property, especially in the modern sense of cybersecurity being so easily hacked nowadays?
Yeah. I don't know. Sorry. I don't know. It's a good question. Cybersecurity isn't the only obstacle. I mean, somehow we do manage to protect it with other trade partners. You know, like the same things don't happen in the EU. Go ahead.
If I look at like the EU, I would say they accept that intellectual property has to be protected. And
Yeah,
we
exactly.
find it mutually acceptable.
Exactly.
How do you work with a partner who's trying to undermine you?
Well, that's a good question. It takes creative thinking. I don't know, maybe you don't. You know? If you say to yourself, let's just game it out in one example. I'm just making this up. But let's game it out in one example. We need certain kind of microprocessors for all of our F-35s, okay? The question is, should our adversary, who is competing against us, have access to that and be able to replicate it and then use it against us? Or should there be a ban on that? Like, that is a pretty easy example, and it gets more nuanced and complicated when you get into these other things that are non-national security related, like, washing machines or something like that, something that's kind of neutral, that is a big industry here, or maybe that can be, stolen abroad. I don't know how to deal with that. There are smarter people, much smarter people than me on those kinds of issues. But there are certain principles that we can follow. You trade certain things with certain countries. And while the other countries misbehave with a view to consciously exploiting us, we don't do that. One of the problems is, this is one of the issues that Trump speaks about, just one second, about special interests. I mean, do you think that people in the US government or in the DOD are fools? They don't know that this is going on? They're extremely intelligent people that have been tracking the Chinese actions on this for a very long time. The issue is, as I said, the narrow, short-sighted special interests. Boeing wants to forget Boeing. What about this recent, for a moment after the Iran deal was hatched, all of the European oligarchs ran to Iran. Commercial plane companies, they saw that they can make billions like this. Do you think Iran's going to be any different in this specific regard of ripping off these products in China? No, of course not. They don't care. They don't care they care in the long run. They don't really care in the short run. So those